Welcome to Mini Mind Hack. Have you ever felt like you're several different people rolled into one body? The version of you at home, the version at work, the version you show on social media, and wondered which of them is the real you? What feels like fragmentation is, in fact, exactly what contemporary neuroscience and social science predict. There isn't a single, hidden locus of identity in the brain waiting to be discovered. Identity is a dynamic, context-sensitive process. Antonio Damasio, a Portuguese-American neuroscientist who leads research at the University of Southern California, is one of the most influential thinkers in modern consciousness science. He became widely known for showing how emotions, bodily states, and higher cognition are inseparably linked, and his work fundamentally changed how we understand what a self even is. Damasio argues that the self isn't a single entity located in one part of the brain, but a dynamic construction emerging from many parallel processes: bodily signals, emotions, memory, and constantly shifting neural patterns. In his work, he describes consciousness and the self as emergent products of brain-body interaction, a running account the brain continually updates as it manages the body and the world. Classic neuropsychology gives us a dramatic demonstration of this idea. Studies of split brain patients, people whose two cerebral hemispheres have been surgically disconnected, revealed an interpreter mechanism in the left hemisphere that invents narratives to make sense of actions initiated elsewhere in the brain. Michael Gazzaniga, often called the father of cognitive neuroscience, is an American researcher who has spent decades studying how different regions of the brain contribute to the experience of self. Much of his work comes from split brain patients, which allowed him to observe how the left and right hemispheres can produce conflicting thoughts or actions. What he discovered is that the brain doesn't panic when this happens. Instead, a system he calls the interpreter instantly builds a coherent, believable story that explains our behavior, even if the real cause came from somewhere else entirely. That capacity to generate a retrospective narrative is a core reason we experience a sense of a continuous self. The brain stitches events together into a story, and that story feels like me. But the stitching is a construction, not proof of a unitary conductor. A powerful modern framework that helps explain both the neural mechanics and the fluidity of identity is predictive processing. Think of the brain as a prediction engine. It constantly generates hypotheses about incoming sensory data and updates those hypotheses when reality disagrees. Anil Seth is a British neuroscientist and professor at the University of Sussex, well known for making complex ideas about consciousness understandable to a broad audience. His research focuses on how the brain generates perception by constantly predicting what's out there and updating those predictions with incoming sensory data. Seth describes both perception and the sense of self as a kind of controlled hallucination, not in the sense of being fake, but as the brain's best, continuously revised guess about reality and about who we are, built to keep us stable, adaptive, and alive. Under this model, different contexts invite different predictive models to dominate. At work, your brain's priors and goals push it to predict and enact one set of behaviors. At home, a different set becomes salient. The implication is straightforward. Identity is what the brain predicts about itself in a given situation, and so it will vary as circumstances change. This isn't a philosophical metaphor. It's an active theory in contemporary neuroscience and cognitive science. Karl Friston is a British neuroscientist and one of the most cited researchers in the entire field, known for bringing mathematical clarity to how the brain operates. He developed what's called the free energy principle, a framework suggesting that all living systems, including human brains, work to reduce surprise by constantly predicting what will happen next and adjusting when they're wrong. In this view, identity isn't a fixed property, but part of the brain's ongoing effort to minimize prediction error, keeping our internal model of ourselves stable enough to function, yet flexible enough to adapt. When a brain encounters novel or conflicting social demands, it either updates its internal model or acts to change the world so that the prediction is met. Both choices can make identity feel unstable. If your life forces you to continually adapt to mismatched expectations, for example, contradictory roles at work and at home, Your brain's minimization strategy can produce rapid switching between different selves rather than settling on one consistent identity. Friston's work gives us vocabulary and mechanisms for understanding why identity is adaptive and distributed rather than fixed. Psychology and sociology add necessary layers to the picture by showing how social context shapes the self. George Herbert Mead and Irving Goffman were two major American social theorists who shaped how we think about identity. Mead, a key figure of the Chicago School, studied how the self grows out of social interaction. Goffman, one of the most influential sociologists of the 20th century, analyzed everyday life as a kind of performance. Together, they showed that the self emerges through interaction and performance. Mead's symbolic interactionism emphasizes that we internalize the attitudes of others and that our self-concept is built from social exchange. Goffman's dramaturgical model shows how we present different faces depending on the stage and audience. In short, identity is not only constructed inside the skull, it is negotiated in everyday encounters, roles, and expectations. If your workplace requires a formal, composed persona, and your family setting invites intimacy and vulnerability, those contexts will both shape and reveal different versions of you. This interdisciplinary convergence explains several common experiences. First, the sense of being split or inconsistent is often a natural consequence of adaptive cognition. Different neural circuits and predictive models are optimized for different tasks and social environments, and they will lead to different sets of preferences, behaviors, and emotional responses. Second, attempts to force a single, rigid identity can cause stress. The psychological construct called self-concept clarity, the extent to which a person's beliefs about themselves are clearly defined, internally consistent, and stable, is useful here. Research shows that low clarity correlates with distress and less stable well-being. But importantly, the healthiest approach is not to demand immutability. Instead, it's to cultivate coherent narratives and functional patterns across contexts. In other words, stability comes from integrating the most adaptive parts of your various selves, not from pretending they don't exist. Narrative identity research provides a practical route to that integration. Dan McAdams, an American psychologist known for his work on personality and narrative identity, argues that people build internal, evolving life stories. These stories help us organize our past, imagine our future, and give us a sense of unity and purpose. But narrative identity is itself flexible. We revise our self-narratives as new evidence arrives, and different group memberships or cultural scripts will emphasize different storylines. That's why people who migrate between cultures, change careers, or go through major life transitions often temporarily report feeling lost. Their existing narrative scaffolding no longer fits, and a new integrated story is still under construction. Cultivating narrative skills, reflecting on recurring themes, identifying turning points, and articulating intentions helps the brain reduce prediction error across contexts and produces a more resilient sense of self. All of this also reframes common advice about finding yourself. The cultural demand to discover a single authentic self is historically and socially inflected. Many Western narratives glorify authenticity as a moral ideal. But from a neuroscientific and sociological point of view, finding implies a fixed target that doesn't exist. Instead, a more useful aim is to develop meta-awareness, recognize which version of yourself is active in a given context, why it's adaptive, and which versions are sustainable over time. That means paying attention to energy, values, and outcomes. Which roles leave you depleted, and which leave you energized? Which behaviors align with long-term goals, and which feel like temporary performances you've been trained to enact? Tracking these patterns gives you practical leverage to shape the stories your brain will tell about you. There are also therapeutic and everyday practices that follow naturally from this model. Narrative therapy and identity work focus on externalizing problems, mapping different self-states, and creating alternative stories. Mindfulness and interoceptive training, paying attention to bodily signals, can help stabilize experience by making predictions more precise. When you know how your body responds to stress, you can update your predictive model more accurately and reduce surprise. Similarly, deliberately designing contexts that encourage adaptive versions of yourself, choosing communities, schedules, and roles that align with your values, reduces the need for constant switching, and builds a more coherent life narrative. These are actionable strategies grounded in research on the brain's predictive nature and on psychosocial approaches to identity. Finally, an empirical, non-judgmental attitude toward identity is important. Think of yourself less as a failing unified object and more as a system with multiple modules that can be coordinated. Histories of trauma, social marginalization, or abrupt life changes complicate the coordination task. They don't prove the absence of a real self. They show how sensitive the system is to context and stress. The goal is not to eliminate difference within you, but to increase intelligibility, to notice patterns, to build narratives that bind important elements together, and to create environments that support the versions of you you most want to strengthen. If you walk away with one practical insight, let it be this: being not one person is not a pathology. It's the brain doing what it evolved to do. Identity is a continuous process of prediction, performance, and narrative integration. Understanding that process gives you the tools to shape it, to choose which stories to tell about yourself, and to design the contexts in which the most life-affirming versions of you can flourish. Thank you for watching. If you found this video enlightening, please like, comment, or subscribe to support more content like this. The description below includes studies and sources for deeper reading. I really appreciate you spending this time with me. See you next time.